Yes, as I mentioned, we have a very special opportunity of enjoying Brother Couch from the headquarters at Bethel this morning. Subject is the photodrama of creation. Now, Brother Couch.
The photodrama of creation was put together by the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society about 66 years ago. So what you're going to see this morning is really an old-time movie. There's very little we know about the photodrama because all the brothers who had anything directly to do with it, or many of them indirectly, they've all died over those years. We had very few records kept. And so what I know about the photodrama is something I've picked up in the past 5 or 6 years in showing it. Brothers who were then alive and did have something to do with it passed it on. But it's interesting. It seemed to get its start back in 1911 at the International Bible Students Convention that year, when a group of the brothers approached Pastor Russell and asked him if a delegation, including himself, would make a trip around the world and visit, well, they said the so-called heathen nations especially. Nations like Japan and China, Asia, Africa, with the thought in mind of seeing if some of those countries wouldn't be acceptable to the truth. Now, up until that time, you might as well say the truth was pretty well centered here in the United States and almost around Pennsylvania, Ohio, New York. It was almost local. True, we had a branch in England, started around 1910, but there were very few witnesses. In many parts of the world, there were just none, or most parts, I should say. And so the brothers got to thinking to themselves, surely, of all the people on earth, there must be someone in those countries who would be interested in the truth. Well, they selected a committee of 7. Pastor Russell was one of them, the first president of the society. They all paid their own expenses. Pastor Russell took along Brother Rutherford as his secretary. And they set out in December, the latter part of December 1911, to make this trip. They went over to Hawaii. It was by boat, of course. Then over to Japan and China, South Asia, Africa, and worked their way on back through Europe. They were gone for 3 months. And what they found out was staggering. Of course, at that time, they were invited to go into the churches and the synagogues to preach in these countries. But they found out every place they went in, they packed out the auditoriums, standing room only. And they visited people out in the countryside in these lands to see what they thought of the second coming of Christ Jesus, and to their amazement, the people were very receptive to it. Well, now here was the story. They understood Matthew 24:14 just as well as we understand it here this morning. And here were people that wanted to hear the truth, but there were absolutely no one to preach to them. Once they left those lands, there wasn't a soul left there to carry on the work. And so it was during this trip that the photodrama of creation was born in the mind of Pastor Russell. He conceived this educational idea that was so far ahead of its day, something that we could teach thousands of people in a short period of time. Now, this was in 1911, 1912. They thought that 1914 in October would no doubt bring the end of this system of things, so you can see why they were more than anxious to get the gospel of the kingdom preached. Well, they came back and they started to work in this photodrama, something that people could see and hear in their own language. 2 ways they were going to educate people. Both of them were quite new. Back in 1911, you can just imagine the movie industry at that time. It was just in its infancy. People like Thomas Edison were still playing with it and trying to develop it. And of course, they had the phonograph back at that time, but it was pretty crude, the old Edison phonograph. But so they took these two instruments and put them together to produce the photodrama. And what it was a complete story of the Bible, from the creation days right down through the story of the Bible to Armageddon, into the paradise earth after Armageddon. Not only did those in the audience see, but they recorded the message on a phonograph record, and they would put it on and they could hear it at the same time. And the results was just tremendous. It was 8 hours in length. 2 hours was motion picture that you're going to see here this morning. And then 6 hours of it was slides. And they had 80 brothers they called in, gave them a little training on electricity, because it isn't like today. You go into Kingdom Hall, it's all the same voltage and so on, so you just plug it in. But in those days, they went into a town with different current. They had to do some rewiring. I remember a brother told me one time he had to get a tub of salt water, make a solution, run the wires through it to reduce the current so it wouldn't burn up his machine. But they were trained for the little bit of emergencies they'd meet up against. And each one of them had 2 hours of the photodrama. And what they would do, they'd schedule a visit here tonight. So whoever was starting it off, he'd spend his 2 hours tonight. He'd get on a train the next day or that night and go to his next assignment. The next brother would fall in with the 2 hours, the third 2 hours, and the fourth 2 hours. They had an 8-hour showing. And they just kept on the move. They were scheduled for 6 months. That's as far as their schedule took them. Well, they thought they'd have it ready by 1912, but that didn't happen. 1913 went by, and it wasn't until January the 14th, 1914, the whole thing was complete, ready to go. The first showing was in New York City at a theater that the Society purchased on 62nd and Broadway. And the New York Times, I looked it up in their archives, and they had an article that said that 5,000 attended this unusual showing, and 5,000 were turned away. And it went on. It was in Pittsburgh and Cincinnati the same weekend. So that kicked it off. And then these 80 brothers were sent out on the road. The results was tremendous. They traveled in 6 months. It went across United States, Canada, into Europe, over into the East, Fiji Islands, New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines. And 6 months it traveled around the world. And do you know how many people by count saw and heard this 8-hour story of the Bible? 9 million people by count. Now, how long would it take us today, with the tremendous organization of preachers that we have, to take 9 million people and very patiently sit down with them and explain them the whole story of the Bible? It would be a pretty big job, wouldn't it? But that's what they accomplished at that time. And the interesting thing about it, they made it interesting. They made it attractive to people. And almost every town where they would in the afternoon, they'd have a matinee for the school children. They'd close down the schools, and all the school children in the town could go and see the photodrama. And to this day, I just have great numbers of the brothers come up and say, I saw it first when I was a little boy or a little girl in school. Because at that time, where are you going to go to a movie? And especially, where are you going to go to a movie that you'll see color and sound? Now, this is back in 1914. That was the two first to it. So what they did, they took something unusual, and they put it together, and it was very attractive. And when the people came, then they got the truth from it. Those were the two first, the color. And what they did, by hand, they took 2 complete sets of it under a large magnifying glass, and they colored all the slides and every frame of the movie. Well, they didn't paint it. It was a tint they used. It was red and greens. But they did it by hand. Now, when you see this movie, there must be about 15 frames, I think, to this a second. So every second you'll see 15 pictures. Well, they had to do all that by hand. And they did some of it in Paris. Where the movie was made, we don't know. There's one part of it I know the story on. But outside of that, we haven't got the least idea where it was filmed, who filmed it, who played in it. I do know this, that some of it was done by the Pathé brothers in Paris. And some of it was filmed here in the United States. We do know it was filmed on location. The pictures you see in Egypt, it was filmed there in Egypt. Or in the Garden of Gethsemane, that's where it was filmed. And I think you'll see that it's very unusual. And then the sound, what they did, they just took a phonograph record and recorded it. They would synchronize it with the picture, and they had talking pictures back there at that time. I saw talking pictures, I think it was about 1928. That's what they called them, talking pictures. It was Jeanette MacDonald and someone, it was the movie, Nelson Eddy. Well, we thought that was tremendous. But little did I know that years ago, someone else had it. The first time it was invented, Thomas Edison invented sound. And he had color. In 1907, he had about 2 or 3 minutes of film on color, and he hooked up his phonograph to the picture. But it wasn't a movie. It was only a few minutes. But as far as I know, a man called me here from Kansas, some movie industry, and asked me about the Photodrama. He found out that I showed it somewhere, and he was interested in it, in old movies. And so he's the one that told me about Thomas Edison, but he said, no doubt this is the first full-length movie that was ever in color and ever had sound to it. So it made it a little interesting. What will you get out of seeing the Photodrama, something that's that old? Well, it's interesting. It's history to the organization. We read the Bible to pick up history. We go back and read about the creation of Adam and Eve and the story of the flood. If it wasn't for the history recorded there, we'd never know. Can you imagine the discussions that we would have where we came from if it wasn't for the Bible? So it gives you faith. It builds faith. And it's the same way today to see this old movie. I'm sure you can turn on the television or go to the movie and you'll see far better pictures. But I think it's interesting to see what the organization did far ahead of its time in producing this. And it just proves to me that the Lord's arm is not short. He wanted the good news preached. He had it recorded in the Bible. There were people all over the earth who wanted to hear it. There was no one to preach it, so what did he do? Minor thing to put together something that man could make and show it all over the world and have thousands upon thousands of people see it, hear it, and come into the organization. So indirectly, how many of us here this morning were in the truth because of the Photodrama creation? And indirectly, that's how I came in contact with the truth. And so it made a tremendous contribution to the organization. There's 2 reels of it. The first one's about an hour in length. The last one's a half hour. I'll try to keep it speeded up. Maybe running just a little fast so we can show it in the hour and a half, and I'll narrate it. There's a soundtrack on it, but I can give you more information by narrating, and I'll tell you a little of the story and some of the background as we go along to save time. So if we wait till I get back to the projector, we can turn the lights out and we'll start. In the introduction, Pastor Russell comes out and introduces the Photodrama. And so what I did, so you could see the first president of the society as well as hear him, I took one of the old records that we had left there at Bethel. It's pretty scratchy and noisy. And I recorded a little bit of his introduction on a cassette. And so as he comes out and introduces the photodrama, I'll turn the cassette on and you can hear his voice as well as see him.
The Photodrama of Creation is presented by the IBSA, the International Bible Students Association. Its aim is public instruction along religio-scientific lines and in defense of the Bible as the inspired Word of God. Many claim that each of its parts is more helpful than a year in college, or the 4 parts equal to 4 years or more. We trust that this may prove to be so for everyone now present. As the motive of the enterprise, we reply that it is purely philanthropic. It is supported wholly by voluntary contributions, and these come from Bible students who themselves greatly benefited, are desirous of passing the blessing on to other hearts and heads. Surely the value of an intelligent knowledge of God and the Bible is inestimable. The Photodrama of Creation presents the 7 days of creation as 7 epochs, each 7,000 years long, and the 7th day as not yet complete. In this view, 1,000 years of the 7th day remain, during which earth and her population will reach the grand perfection designed by the Creator. It is held that this final 1,000 years has already begun. To this fact is accredited the great progress of our day, intellectually and materially.
Here are a few frames on the introduction showing when God created the original animals in the beginning, the size of them compared with our modern day elephant. But this is all the film that we could find on this. Our first story takes us into the flood, the time of Noah's time. Here you see Noah and his family, his sons building the ark. Noah was around 600 years old when they finished the ark. It took them between 50 and 60 years to build. It was a large structure. It was about 437 feet long and over 73 feet wide and over 45 feet high. So it was quite an undertaking for an older man and his sons, and especially they built it under adverse conditions. The ark once finished, here you see the animals going in. I think they only had 1 camel because it shows the camels going in one at a time. My brother Bethel told me he didn't even think it was a camel. He thought they made it look like a camel. But whether that's true or not, I don't know. But they had 2 elephants and 2 of the rest of the animals that they would take in. It's interesting, Bible critics will point to the story of the flood as recorded in the Bible and ridicule the Bible, saying that couldn't be true. That many animals living on earth couldn't be put into a vessel the size of the ark. Well, today it's true, we have recorded about 750,000 species. But it's so interesting to note that those species could come from about 124 different kinds. And the majority would be from the bird family. And so when you see, according to man's own wisdom as far as the animal world is concerned, and the reptile and the birds, that it can be true. So there was enough room in the ark to put the kinds that God said should be put in there, along with food, living quarters for Noah and his family. Here they have the animals in, and Jehovah God is the one that will direct them into the ark to see that it's closed at the proper time. And of course you can imagine what the people in that community thought, building this floating vessel that size. They made fun of Noah and his family. It never rained. Noah preached all those years it was going to rain from heaven, which had never happened before. And so the people ridiculed them. It's the same today. You tell people that Armageddon's going to come, the earth is going to be made a paradise, they don't believe it. But here we see the rain starting to fall. The first time it ever rained on earth. And as we know, the earth was watered from the ground up. Here you can tell by this man's gestures that the water is getting a little high. Of course, they all were believers now. They knew that Noah was telling them the truth, and there wasn't a soul that wouldn't have wanted to get into the ark. But, sad to say, it was too late. God gave them their opportunity, and when the flood waters came, it was too late for them. The Bible tells us that the water rose 22 feet above the highest mountain. And I think as you watch this, you have to keep in mind that it was filmed those many years ago, and some of the technique that they used is so interesting. Here Noah is wanting to ascertain the water conditions on the earth after many months floating around. So he turned the dove loose. Looks to me like an old New York pigeon. I think wigs have improved over the years. Little interesting things I see when the dove comes back. Instead of lighting on the windowsill, why someone, of course, hands it to Noah, but either that or he picked it out of the air. But a little interesting. And then when the waters dried up from the earth, look at the details in the back of that picture. Birds flying around, feathers like vapor coming out of that large vessel with animals in it, just as you would expect. And there's just so many things that the detail was excellent. Some said the society had a studio somewhere up in the Bronx in New York that they did this filming. But it's only hearsay. And we know from the Bible account that the first thing that Noah did when they come out of the ark, he and his family, was to offer a sacrifice to the Creator. And Noah was a picture of Christ Jesus. His wife pictured those of the anointed, and the sons and their wives pictured the other sheep who will survive Armageddon and live into the paradise earth. And of course the ark was their place of safety. Today man's place of safety is his faith in the Creator, and he gets that faith from the Bible and the spiritual provisions that God supplies to us through his organization. And of course the rainbow appeared in the background, and at that time they would go on and explain the covenant that Jehovah God made with man. Some of these stories, of course, are cut short because the film was all lost and was just picked up here and there. Here is the time that Abraham was commanded to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. And this is the only portion of the photodrama that we actually know where it was filmed and who played in it. 30-some years or more ago, I was doing circuit work up around Yonkers, New York. And one afternoon I was working with an older brother by the name of Vandermeer, and he said, "You see up there alongside of the mountain?" Well, he says, in 1913 I took my Model T Ford, went down to Bethel and picked up Pastor Russell and 3 of the Bethel brothers. And he says, we made the portion of Abraham's sacrifice in Isaac for the photodrama. Well, I had never seen the photodrama at that time. It didn't even exist. But I listened to his story, and years later, then when I saw this for the first time after we found pieces in kingdom halls and brothers' homes and put it together again, I remembered his story. I was sad that I didn't ask him more about it, but I was glad to get that information. Abraham and Isaac lived in Beersheba, which is a distance, well, about a 3-day journey here to Mount Moriah. Why they came here to this particular place, the Bible account doesn't say. It may be because they were looking for a secluded spot that God wanted them to come here. What they were doing was a holy thing. God commanded it to be done. And so they may want to come up here where there would be no one around. That's not a scriptural thought. It's just one line of reasoning why it may have been. You'll notice Isaac goes to a lot of trouble in preparing the fire, laying out the stones and the wood to make the fire. Well, that was so they could draw out the picture, so they could tell the story of Abraham and Isaac, why it was recorded in the Bible and what it meant. Isaac was a lad of about, well, he was around 24, 25 years old at that time. And he was obedient. He was making a picture. He pictured the greater Isaac, Christ Jesus, who willingly came down here to earth and offered his life as a ransom for the benefit of mankind. And it showed the obedience on the part of Abraham and the part of Isaac to carry through what God would have them to do. You notice the butchered apron hasn't changed in style since Abraham's time. Here Isaac is asking his father, well, where's the lamb? And of course Abraham says that God has directed that he's to be the lamb. Now Isaac here wasn't begging off. He was appreciative of the fact that he could be considered worthy to offer his life as a sacrifice, just the same as Christ Jesus was willing. Isaac was a Jewish boy of Bethel who worked in the kitchen. He was a cook. Abraham was an Armenian brother by the name of Phares. And the angel that appears to stop Abraham's arm there, his name was Cotton. Whatever happened to these brothers, of course, Brother Phares died. Whatever happened to the other two who were younger, I could never find out. They left Bethel and drifted away from New York. It would be interesting if we could ever run onto them. No doubt they're dead by now. They could give us a lot of the background to the photodrama. Our next story we go into is the time of the first Passover down in Egypt. We remember the story how Moses was in Midian. God directed him to go down into Egypt because it was time to free the Israelites from their bondage and slavery to the Egyptians. And so Moses went down, and he told the Israelites what God had commanded him to do. He appeared before the Pharaoh to tell him that God had commanded to let the Israelites go. But of course we remember the story as recorded in the Bible. The king refused. They went the second time. The king kept refusing, and different plagues fell upon the land of Egypt. The second plague, fourth, fifth, seventh, eighth, ninth, But then there was one more plague, and that was to be the death of the firstborn. And in order to prepare the Israelites for this, they were to celebrate a Passover. And there in Exodus, the 12th chapter, it tells us that they were to kill a lamb or a goat, a year old, a male. And on Nisan the 14th, they were to cook it, well done, over the fire, head with its legs. They were to eat it, standing, staff in their hand. And here we see Moses with the beard, that would be Aaron, his brother, directing the Pharaoh. There he's telling them to stand. And he gives direction that they should get the staff as God commanded. They all should have a staff in their hand. And they were to eat it in haste because it was the Lord's Passover. They were to mark the doorposts with blood. And by this, when the Passover angel passed through the land of Egypt this night, on Nisan the 14th, the angel would pass over the households where they celebrated the Passover. But where they didn't mark the doorposts with the blood, then someone in that household would die, the firstborn of whether it was a human or animals. And so here Moses is taking charge, passing out the bread. And it's interesting, it was obedience. That's what God was requiring of his people, the same as Abraham. Would they listen? Would they kill their best lamb, or would they kill their old one? Would they eat it roasted over the fire with its head, with its legs? Or would some say, well, I don't like roast lamb, it's too greasy, I have a bad stomach, I'll boil it. Well done is the thing. No, that wasn't it. Or maybe some would say, well, why do we have to stand and eat? We're going to have a long journey. Why don't we recline, rest as much as possible, so we can be well prepared for this long trip out of Egypt? No, that wasn't what God wanted. He gave them detailed, minute instructions of what he wanted them to do in order for them to have his protection and blessing to get out of the land of Egypt. We'll visit some of the homes of the Egyptians. Here's the Pharaoh's home. They've just succeeded, the attendants, in putting the oldest son to sleep. And the dad will come in to bid his son good night. But they didn't celebrate the Passover. They didn't mark their doorposts with blood. They didn't eat the lamb. They didn't even believe in the Creator. So we'll see what happens in this family. Well, it meant that someone would lose their life because of not listening to what God wanted them to do. A life was lost here. Here's another home. This is a miller and his wife. They're busy making flour. They didn't celebrate the Passover. They didn't believe in letting the Egyptian go, or the Israelites go, that the government was right in keeping them because they needed their workers. So we'll see what happens here. So their child lost her life because they refused to listen. Now this was the story, the picture all over the land of Egypt. In every household that didn't celebrate the Passover, there was a death. And the Bible says that a mournful cry went up out of the land of Egypt this night. They went to their gods, the many gods that they worshiped there in Egypt. But this was a night of complete vindication to the name of Jehovah God. What happened on Passover night, it traveled through the known world at that time. Everyone knew about it, that the power and the might that God of the Israelites displayed. Some of their gods there in Egypt, their wizards, they could perform some of the miracles of the plagues, but none of them could bring back to life any of the dead, because only the Creator knows the secret of life. Here you see Moses and Aaron and some of the older men of Israel entering the scene. Of course, they're upset with them. They're blaming the death of their loved ones on them. But when Moses comes in, he gives them a little speech, and he tells them that this is something that God brought down upon them because they refused to let his people go to worship him as God commanded. But even at that, the people didn't want Pharaoh to let them go. They wanted that free labor. But finally Pharaoh told Moses, go and get out of Egypt. And here we see them marching out of the land. The Bible record shows that there was 600,000 able-bodied men, along with the children, the women, the old men. It amounted to something like 3 million people marched out of this land on this day. It's interesting, the Bible mentioned that when they left Egypt, they took from the Egyptians gold and silver and garments of material. And sometimes we wonder, well, why did they do that? Why would they take any gift from the Egyptians? Well, now, why were the Israelites in slavery? Was it because they were defeated as a nation in battle? Or were they bought with a price as a nation to make them slaves? The only reason they were slaves because they multiplied so rapidly that the Egyptians became fearful that they'd outpopulate them and rule over them. And so that's why they killed off their children. They made them slaves so they could keep them under control. And so any of the gold or silver that they received from the Egyptians, it was something that was rightly due to them, that they had earned over the years and years that they were in slavery down there to the Egyptians. In no way was it a gift. The original Photodrama took them through the Red Sea, but we could never find that part of the film. And so we can only take you out of Egypt, showing you going out of Egypt. And this other place you'll see the film's cut short, and that's why. Here's an interesting account when King Saul, the first king of Israel, visited the witch of Endor. As it opens up here, the scene, Saul has just been informed that Ahimelech, the high priest coming in there, had given David, who Saul had made an outlaw, a sword and some food. And Saul was just upset about that. And so he threatened the high priest with death because he turned a traitor against him and had taken sides with David. That's Jonathan, Saul's son, who was a good friend of David, trying to persuade his dad not to kill the high priest. So he runs out and tells Ahimelech what his father's going to do. You tell by his motion he's going to kill him. So he's telling the priest to flee. What's that little girl there? She kneels down and kisses the priest's skirt. And just like a kid, she keeps looking back at her mother, whoever that is. Just as much saying, will I do it again? Watch her now. Typical kid. But anyway, the priests, they go into the temple there, lock themselves in, and they approach Jehovah in prayer. And then Saul comes with his army, with his bodyguards, to execute him, to carry out his threat. Remember when the Israelites wanted a king? God told Samuel, let them have a king. If they don't want me as king, let them have a king. One of theirs, like the heathens, he'll mistreat them. He'll be a burden to them. And here he is, the first king. He got proud and haughty, and he started to take over things that was in the nation of worship that was none of his business. And so he completely lost Jehovah's spirit. And here you see he's setting fire to the temple to burn the priests out, to execute them. There was 144,000, 84 priests, I think, he executed along with the Ahimelech. And the Bible says he killed their families too. But watch them when they come out of this burning building to show you how real it looks. It just looks as if they are on fire. Of course, maybe back in those days they did set them on fire. But there's smoke there anyway. But it's tremendous photography. I've worked with the society and making a few films that we've produced over the years. And just to make a little 10-minute part in a film, you spend days, you spend nights rehearsing, taking, retaking, cutting. And I'll bet that when they filmed this thing, they just turned their cameras on and ground it out. And the photography just simply, it just amazes me. You see the old Charlie Chaplin movies, years later they jump and flicker and blink. But the photography is good, the pictures are clear, there's light on them. So whoever did it, they did a fine job. Here's King Saul, and this frame of mind, in come a messenger and brings him word that these hated enemies of the Philistines are approaching the army of Israel for battle. These Philistines were a thorn in his side all during his kingship. And he goes out to the army, the camp, and mark you, they persuade King Saul to go and visit the witch of Endor to find out how he'll make out in battle, how the Israelites will make out in battle. Previously, Saul had issued a decree that all witches, fortune tellers, soothsayers should be driven out of the land or executed because they were demonized. But here he is, taking off his kingly crown, disguising himself as the king, and going out to seek the witch of Endor, going to inquire of the demons. It shows you how once a person loses God's Spirit and the truth, how blind do they get? Just went the direct opposite course. So he takes 2 of his bodyguards, and they set off to find the witch of Endor. And along the way they inquire where the witch lived, where her cave was, and here's some men that could give them the proper directions. Wait till you see her. If you ever saw a witchy witch, she's one of them. So Saul tells his bodyguards to stay outside so she won't recognize him while he goes into the witch's cave. And of course, here's all the paraphernalia I guess a witch needs. There's a skeleton and a magpie, and there's the witch laying over here in the rock. She doesn't recognize Saul, and she's a little leery of the whole situation because she's fearful for her life. So she starts to leave, and Saul mentions Samuel's name. And that brought her back. And then finally, she recognizes Saul. What's the expression in her face then when she recognizes him? Terrific acting. She thinks she's going to lose her life, but it says there he offered her immunity from his own law if she would stir up division and bring Samuel back. All we have of the remainder of this, it shows her drawing Samuel's picture on the wall and the fire flying, and that's all we have of the story of bringing Samuel back. What it was like in the original, I don't know. But anyway, the evil spirits brought him word that the Israelites would lose in battle. So Saul went into a demon rage, and he runs back to the camp, tells the soldiers what information he had gathered that they would lose the battle. And so they prepare for battle the next day with the Philistines. Here's the altogether was 500 actors played in making the photodrama. Costly battle for the army of Israel. Jonathan lost his life. He was killed there. Even to make the costumes for that many people was a tremendous undertaking. And it was then that Saul, in his frame of mind, committed suicide. It's interesting to go back and read the account there of this and many of the little details that helps you to remember. Here is the story of Elisha when he resurrected the Shulamite boy. You notice this is the first portion you've seen in color. Even after all those years, of course the color is faded out, but you see the improvement that it makes in the film. Here, several weeks ago, I saw a little piece of the film, the original film. It was in a book, in color, and those colors were just as bright and clear. But the story here, this couple, when the prophet would visit this part of the country, they would have him for a meal. They weren't believers or worshipers of Jehovah God, but certainly they believed that he was a prophet of the true God. And so from the time of his last visit till now, they build a room on top of their house just for Elisha and his servant when they would visit. And they were just showing Elisha there the room, and he was just taken back by their kindness. They were childless because the father was too old to father a child to the husband. So he sent the servant down to see what they could do for the woman, some little kind gesture. And the servant there, he's asked her if she has any kids, and she says no. But all the kids in the neighborhoods that came by, they'd greet her and she'd kiss them. They made it sort of the headquarters for a playground. And of course, at that time, some woman who didn't have children was sort of looked down upon. But the servant goes back and tells Elisha that she has no children. You can tell by his gestures what he's telling him. No little ones. And so Elisha says God will give her a child for her kindness. So a son was promised. And as they take leave, why, looks like the kids are playing jacks back there. As they take leave, why, Elisha tells her that she's going to have a child. She didn't believe it. No, she says she's not going to have any. But he says God will give you a child. Kids are interested in this conversation. And sure enough, with the 9-month period, she had a son. And we look into the boy, the family now, about 12 years later, no doubt. And here's the mother sending the boy off to the field to be with his father, which was the custom when a child got to be a certain age that he learned his father's business. She went about her housework. And it was while the boy was out here in the field with the father that he took sick. We don't know what the disease the child had, but the Bible just refers to it as a brain fever. Terrific acting on the part of the child for those times. But anyway, the dad tells the servant to take the child back home to the mother, and she has her knitting all mixed up. And they bring the child in. And the child dies in the arms of its mother. It's amazing. The brother said when he used to show this that you wouldn't find a dry eye in the audience. Today we're a little hardened to death scenes, the war pictures we see, the cowboy movies and every other thing. It just seems that we see death all around us. But back in those years it wasn't so. Very sad scene. Here was a mother, their only son. A short time before that he was healthy and happy, and here he is, died right in her arms. But it's interesting what she did. And she's the one who did it. In many parts of the stories in the Bible, the women play a tremendous role. She took the boy up and put him in Elisha's bed. And then she went out to hunt up Elisha. He was away, I guess about 20 miles away with his assignment. And she knew he was a true prophet, and if she was going to get any help, it had to be from him. So she left the boy up there in Elisha's room, and she went off to find Elisha. She found him. Elisha didn't want to come back. He had a busy schedule. And he sent his servant. Well, the servant could go if he wanted to. But she told Elisha that she wasn't going to leave or come back herself until he came back along with her. Well, he just had to give in and come back. And so here she brings him back, takes him up to the room. Elisha wants to be alone as he performs this miracle. So Elisha prays, but the child doesn't wake up. And he keeps on praying. But it seemed that God didn't hear his prayers. So Elisha was ready to give up himself. He starts out, comes back again. And as we read the account, the woman's up, she was upset about the whole affair. She said she didn't ask God for that son, so why did God take the son from her? She just couldn't understand. Little did she realize that she was making a picture that would comfort millions and billions of people in time to come. But Elisha, the Bible says, he put his lips to the boy's lips and the palm of his hands to the boy's palms, and then the boy woke up. And the mother hears what's going on. The servant comes and calls her. And the servant tells her that God awoke her son from the sleep of death. Can't you just picture after Armageddon the resurrection takes place of all the hugging and kissing and the happiness when our loved ones come back in the resurrection, maybe even some of ourselves come back in it. It'll be a time of great rejoicing. You just can't imagine, but here's a picture guaranteeing it. They want to thank Elisha, but no, Elisha says thank God. The boy lived to be, no doubt, to be an old man. I think the Bible account reads some 30 years later we read what he account of him in the scriptures, so he lived a long life, no doubt. This part has to do with, in the Greek scriptures, the birth of Jesus, some of his miracles, and some of the works of the apostles. Here in Luke, you read about the opening. It'll start with the birth of Jesus, when Mary was told that she would be the mother of Jesus. There you'll see an angel appear in the doorway that will give Mary the information. Of course, that was the desire of all the Jewish girls at that time. And Joseph who was engaged to Mary, anxious to protect Mary's name, took her to his home. They were engaged. And of course, then later on, they were married. There were many prophecies recorded in the Hebrew Scriptures regarding Jesus, his birth, the details, something like 300, I believe it is. And it's interesting to see how some of them could have come about. Here's Joseph and Mary in their home after they're married. He's busy about his carpenter trade that he taught to his stepson Jesus. And here was a messenger at that time, any important message, the courier carried it throughout the community. And here is one telling them that all the natives of Judea around Bethlehem had to go back to Bethlehem and register for the tax. And that included Mary and Joseph. They were living down in Nazareth, and they had to go back up to Judea, Bethlehem of Judea. Mary's well along in her pregnancy, and so Joseph tells Mary to go in and pack. He goes around to get transportation, and they prepare to be obedient to the law of the land and what the authorities command them to do. And this is about the only transportation they had at that time that could travel this country. It wasn't an easy trip by any means, especially Mary in her condition. So Mary rides and they start off for Bethlehem. It was a distance, I suppose, somewhere between 75 and 90 miles over very rough terrain. And Mary got along all right. They finally arrived. It would be something like, no doubt, a 3 or 4 or 5 day journey for them at that time. When they arrived, just about what you expect, Bethlehem wasn't a big city. It was called the city of Bethlehem, but it was just a little, might as well say a crossroads, with a inn there. But with all the influx of the people coming in to register from all over the country, you can just imagine what happened to this little place. There was no place to sleep, eat, and almost remind me of the convention we used to have at Yankee Stadium. Just so many people around that you couldn't hardly move. So what happened when Mary got there, and that was what was prophesied, that there'd be no place, there was no place in the inn, so they put her out. It would be like a guest room in the stable. And that's where it was said that Jesus would be born. God knew that. And it's interesting, when it was to be announced to the world, who did God announce it to? Not the head politicians and religious leaders. He took these ordinary folks like the shepherds, and he made the announcement to them. Here you see the shepherds out there in the field at night. One is the watchman, the rest are sleeping. They were familiar with the heavens, and he saw some strange happenings in the heavens, so he wakes up his buddies. And that's when the angel appeared and told him about the birth of Jesus. Born unto you this day. The word spread throughout the known world at that time. Old King Herod got to hear about it. And of course, when he heard there was a future king born around Bethlehem, he got interested. And he sent some of his wise men out there to find out what the story was, and told them to bring the boy back to him. And of course, you can imagine he didn't want him back there to treat him kindly and bring him up as a king. He wanted to do away with him. His throne was interfered with. So here you see these wise men. The Bible doesn't say how many wise men. They picked up the old religious idea, here's 3, and that's what they have. And so they told him, and the ball of fire directed him here to Bethlehem. And back at that time, we thought, now this was the first Christmas. And we celebrated Christmases at Bethel up until 1928, I believe it was, till we found out it was a pagan holiday. But God warned these wise men not to go back to Jerusalem or go back to King Herod. They better go home another way. Then here's the scene when the Israelites were commanded to go up to Jerusalem 3 times each year for their celebration of the festivals. And we just read about them in the Watchtower. But it was quite an occasion for the Israelites. It wasn't something they considered lightly. It was something they looked forward to, these visits up to Jerusalem, because it was gave them an opportunity to meet with other Israelites. They'd go up there and hear the law being read. They'd hear the experience. They'd retell those stories about when their forefathers were down there in Egypt, how God was with them. And what it did, it reassured them. It built their faith to hear these things. And you can see the way they traveled. They didn't have the automobiles and airplanes and motels. Some were rich enough they could ride camels. Here you see these 4 kids. They're carrying trunks and sacrifices. But it was considered quite an occasion. They had to take the sacrifices with them. They had to carry their food with them. And they had to walk. There was no motels or McDonald's in those days. And so it was a rough trip, but a very enjoyable one that they had. All the families would go, the old folks, the kids, and all. And you can see what they were doing here. After I watched this a number of times, I saw they just kept rerunning the film, because there's those kids again, so that they could tell the necessary story. Well, it was practical. I suppose it cost the society about $350,000 at that time to make this film with all free labor. And so you can imagine what that would cost today to produce something like this. But it emphasized upon our minds not to forsake the assembling of ourselves together here at our halls, our circuit assemblies, our conventions. Don't expect to hear something brand new every time, some new light. If you can just keep remembering and keep calling to your attention the things that you know and the things we need to know and the things we forget. That's why we meet together. You're not going to find at a meeting we're going to tell you when Armageddon's going to come or when the resurrection's going to take place. No one knows. The Bible never told us. And so someone could guess at it, but that's about all it means. No, it's just to keep you awake to the spiritual things in your daily life until God brings these things about. Just to hear experiences and rehear the history of the organization is faith building. Here's Jesus when he performed some of his first miracles there in the land of Canaan. Here's a blind man. He wants to be healed, so Jesus, he cures him. He goes off happy about it. A crippled man, he jumps up and walks, throws his crutches away. here's an interesting scene. It's when Jesus walked in water and went out to meet Peter and them. Now, let's think of the photography. It must have had double photography at that time. Here's when Jesus rode into Jerusalem short before his death. Here's the music. That man singing. Here's what he was singing. The singer was Henry Burr. Some of the older brothers here in the hall well remember him as a famous recording artist. He wasn't a Bible student, but he lent his voice to the Photodrama as a contribution. We saw the first Passover being celebrated in Egypt. Here we see Jesus celebrating the last Passover with his apostles and instituting the Lord's evening meal. There on Jesus' left would be the Apostle Peter. John on his right, who was a young man at that time. John lived the longest. He lived up around the year 100. And here in the front right would be, of course, Judas, the one who betrayed Jesus. Now, it was written that one would betray Jesus. And it wasn't hard for Jesus to know who it was. All he had to do was watch his actions, hear him talk. It's the same today. When someone's not going to stick to the truth and not follow Bible principles, they don't have to put a sign on them what they're doing. You can tell by the way they talk and their course of action. And that was the same way with Jesus to Judas. He knew who it was. He was a little sharper than the apostles. He knew he was looking for, because it was recorded someone would. And he brought it up here, and of course they all wanted to know, Lord, is it I? Remember Peter said, Lord, I'll never forsake you. I'll go right down to death if necessary. But when Judas walked up, why, Peter or Jesus told him, you know who it is. And he left the group. The apostles really didn't appreciate what was going on this night. Jesus had explained it to them. He'd have to die. He talked to them about it. He told them this time would come, but they still didn't have the depth of it. And when they went out to the Garden of Gethsemane, it fully proved that. Here Jesus was only going to be with them for a matter of hours. And he'd have to go down in death. And when they come out here to the Garden of Gethsemane, and this is supposed to be where it happened, according to tradition, of course. Whether it did or not, we don't know, but good as any place, I guess. But this is the Garden of Gethsemane, and these old olive trees were there in the days of Jesus. But while Jesus went off to pray, all the rest of them went to sleep. Jesus was bothered. He was troubled at this time. Not that he was afraid to die, but was this the time? Would his dying bring reproach upon his Father's name? And so he petitioned God in prayer. Remember, he said, if it is his will, let this cup pass away. And while he was praying, the angel appeared. Now, what the angel told Jesus, we don't know. It's not recorded in the Scriptures. But there's one thing certain, that he brought Jesus a comforting message from his heavenly Father, no doubt. This is the time. Don't worry about it. Go ahead and do what you're supposed to do. Because from this moment on, Jesus' steps were sure and steadfast. Judas knew where Jesus always went to pray there in the garden, so he brings the soldiers in to take Jesus, because he sold out for 30 pieces of silver. And the one he was to kiss, that would be Jesus. And Jesus knew what he was supposed to do, because he told him to get along with it. Of course, Peter jumped in. He was going to lick the whole Roman army. But it brought about a famous speech by Jesus when he told Peter, put it away. Those who take to the sword will die by the sword. And from that day to this very day, followers of Christ Jesus do not fight with guns and knives, but their weapon that they use is what Paul wrote to the Ephesians when he called it the sword of the Spirit, which is the Bible. It's a better weapon. It's sharper than any two-edged sword, Paul said, and it's so sharp that it'll divide life and death. Well, they took Jesus away. You can just imagine how the apostles felt. Judas knew that he did wrong. He tried to give the money back to the Pharisees, but they wouldn't take it. They knew it was blood money. So he threw it down, went out and committed suicide. Interesting, the steps that followed. Next, they took Jesus to the high priests, that is, to the nation of Israel's own leaders. And they had a trial. They accused him of being a traitor, of trying to set himself up as king, telling the people to refuse to pay taxes, a blasphemer, and they found Jesus guilty. Now here is a nation of people that God was with. He fought their battles. He delivered them. He led them as a nation. And he told them about he'd send his son, had it recorded in their scrolls. They read about it. But when God sent his son down to them, here's what they did. They sentenced him to death. They couldn't put him to death because they had to have the ratification of the Roman governor. They could sentence him, but the Roman governor had to approve it. So they led Jesus away then to the Roman governor, who happened to be in Jerusalem at that time because it was Passover time. But the nation of Israel took their stand before Jehovah God, where they stood, and they stood 100% against him. Here's Peter. Remember Peter said, Lord, I'll stay with you. Well, the old woman there is saying, Peter, well, you're one of them. And Peter said, no, I'm not. The soldiers insisted that he was. Peter denied it again. Now he's brought face to face with Jesus. What's he going to do? Someone who taught him, good friend, and right looking Jesus in the face, he says, I don't know. Now you can imagine how Jesus felt. The very close one to him wouldn't even stand up for his righteous course. But they led Jesus away, and then someone threw a rooster in. And Peter remembered then what Jesus said, before the rooster crows, the cock crows, you'll deny me 3 times. And here is true repentance. Peter was cut to the heart. He knew he did what was wrong. He was sorry. And Jesus forgave, because a short time later from heaven, who was it that Jesus made head spokesman of the Christian congregation? It was Peter. But here we see Jesus being brought in before Pilate. They had to have court outside because the Jews wouldn't go in the same building with the Gentiles. Pilate was bothered. His wife had a dream. She was troubled. He knew they were framing Jesus, that he wasn't guilty of the things they were accusing him of. So he thought, well, I'll get out of it. It was the custom to let a criminal loose on this time of the year. So Pilate told him to go and bring Barabbas, who was the famous criminal that they were going to execute. And then he asked the people, who do you want free? And sure enough, these Jews, they clamored for Barabbas. Old Barabbas can't believe his eyes and ears, what's going on. Because he was a famous criminal. Well, anyway, he got out of there. And the Jews kept hollering to put Jesus to death. And weak-kneed Pilate gave in to them. He tried to get around it by, after led Jesus away, by having a basin of water brought. He washed his hands. But tradition has it he went out and committed suicide after this. Here's an interesting thing. When they hung Jesus up, they showed him being put to death on a cross. At that time, the symbol of the Bible students was the crown and cross. It was only later they found out that the cross was a pagan symbol, that Jesus was put to death on a tree or a stake. But anyway, they go and show the prophecies being fulfilled. They'd give him gall and vinegar to drink. They'd gamble for his clothes. There you see the soldiers gambling for his garment. He'd be hung with thieves, criminals. There they give him gall and vinegar to drink. The Bible said they'd pierce his side. And not a bone of his body would be broken, which was unusual because it'd break the legs of all criminals at that time. But Jesus died, and so it wasn't necessary to break his legs. So it said not a bone of his body would be broken. Joseph, who was a rich man, not a follower of Jesus, went to Pilate and asked him if he could have the body then. to bury in his tomb. So Pilate gave him permission. So they came and took Jesus down. And they took him away to be buried, prepared to be for the burial. But you can see back at that time, seeing the whole story of the Bible as you see it more in detail, more explanation, more scriptures used, why people after 4 nights, they had the truth ready to preach. Sister DeChecka, many of you know her here in this congregation. Her and her sister saw the photodrama in 1914. After 4 nights, that next week they went to the Bible students meeting. The next Sunday they went preaching, and they've been preaching ever since. I was up in Buffalo, New York, showing the photodrama, and I told them the story of Sister Bogart and Sister DeChecka. Sister DeChecka is the oldest member of the Bethel family, and that's how they got the truth. Here the women went out to visit the grave site, and there the angels telling them after Jesus was resurrected that he was gone. Notice it was the women again. The men were back there in Jerusalem behind a locked door. But the women played a very important part in the Bible, as well as they do today in the preaching work. There's no question they do most of it. Here we have persecution set out then on a large scale. And they emphasize this. If you're going to be a follower of Jesus, this is what's going to happen. And here we see the stoning of Stephen. Stephen is a Greek name, but he was a Jewish follower of Jesus. And we thank Stephen for some of the information that's only found in the Bible and what he said before the court, that Moses was 40 years in Midian. He gave Moses' age of 40 when he went there. Stephen told us that God used angels in transmitting the Mosaic law. And he saw Jesus in heaven first, Stephen, in a vision. And this is when Paul stood by and had them stoned to death. Mind you, this looked real, even though they were throwing pillows at him. Especially this last stone that would take his life. I'll tell you, you can't make anything any realer than that. So the photography and acting for those years was outstanding. So, evolution was strong there when the photodrama was being shown. So they took a crack at evolution by displaying the heavenly bodies, how they're put in their orbit, perfectly timed. That just didn't happen. And they gave proof that it didn't happen. Here's the earth going around the sun, producing day and night, perfectly timed. Of course, you see the zodiac signs too. Here was, I thought Walt Disney invented time-lapse pictures, but the brothers showed wheat growing back in 1914. And these were the little things they put into the photodrama to make it unusual, to attract attention to the scriptures. And here's flowers opening out. Well, today this doesn't mean much to us because it's a common, ordinary thing. But back at that time, this was an outstanding feature of the photodrama, an interesting part. I remember a brother told me down in Baltimore, he went to see it, he was a schoolboy, and the only thing he remembered of the photodrama was this flower opening out. He saw it in color. This isn't in color. And that was the only thing he remembered, but he was happy to see that again. But it gave him enough to get the truth. But those were all the little techniques that went into making this quite an unusual program. Some life comes into the world from the womb of the mother, others come from an egg, like a chicken. And so they took the chick and the egg and they developed it to show that this hasn't changed as far as man has a history. There's no sign of it going through any evolution. Of course, we know, living in this part of the country, most of it, it takes 21 days for a chick to hatch. And they showed these different steps. Of course, if you ever watched a peep come out of an egg, this is exactly what happened. Once they break the egg sac on the 21st day and get a breath of air, they start kicking their way out. They don't need a doctor or a nurse. They'll kick their way out of this egg with their mother sitting on top of them with about maybe 15 or 20 brothers and sisters trying to get out at the same time. And you'd wonder how this little critter would come into the world and survive it. Doesn't need a bit of help. The cord is attached to him, and all he does is just kick it off loose himself. But that's the way God meant for him to come into the world. Then he meant for him to be just this cute so he'd be protected. Then he gets hungry and starts eating. In about 8 weeks you can fry him and eat him. But that's what God meant for them to be, or lay an egg. Then Pastor Russell came out in the conclusion, gave a little speech. I have it recorded, but we don't have time for it. Thanking the audience. He gave them all a peace pin, the crown and the cross. Some of you, I suppose, still have it. He said that there would be no collection taken. There'd be a contribution box if anyone wanted to help to pay the expense. He told the audience the society would be glad to show it in other towns, free of charge, if the local congregations would make the arrangement. So it was a very successful production that made a tremendous contribution toward the preaching of the good news of God's kingdom. Something that God brought far ahead of its day. But we can be thankful this morning that we had the photodrama. Thank you.